Welcome again to another session of steganography and watermarking. So we finally arrived at chapter 4, which is we are going to talk about steganalysis. So for this chapter, I hope that you should be able to, after this, define what steganalysis is and list types of signatures used for steganalysis and differentiate different types of steganalysis approach being used to investigate steganalysis investigation. Now, first of all, let's go through the definition of steganography. So previously, we have known that steganography is the art of science where we actually embed secret information within a cover object, and then that cover object is transformed into a stego object. Of course, remember the prisoner's problem. We have the sender, the receiver, and in the middle, we have the warden. So basically, steganalysis is the role of the warden, which is to try and attempt to detect hidden messages that may have been carried out by a steganography method. And also, before any steganalysis attempt is being done, there must be a suspect, or perhaps there is signs of certain communication needs to be investigated. So the role of the warden here to actually try to detect whether there is indeed a hidden information embedded within the suspected media, and in the process try to extract or prove that there is indeed a secret communication going on between the suspects. So here we revisit again the prisoner's problem. As you can see, the model of steganography and steganalysis is basically based on the prisoner's problem, where we have Alice and Bob, which is the sender and receiver, and we have the warden here in the middle trying to actually use steganalysis to detect whatever is being communicated between the suspects. So the objective of steganalysis is actually, first of all, to identify the suspected carrier being used by Alice and Bob. So here, the role of Wendy is to first of all determine what type of media is being used by Alice and Bob to actually communicate secretly. And of course, to begin with, there must be a suspect to the possible secret communication. Once a suspect is identified, the next step is here to identify the suspected carrier being used for the secret communication. And this can be determined by the channel being used or permitted by Wendy for the communication. So let's say between Alice and Bob, the only available channel to communicate is perhaps by using email. Then the suspected carrier could either be text-based or could either be in the form of attachment being shared by Alice and Bob. So first of all is to identify the suspected carrier. Secondly, determine whether the suspected carrier or the stego object earlier indeed carry hidden messages. And by that, try to prove whether there is indeed secret messages within the carrier that is suspected between Alice and Bob. And then the third objective of steganalysis is to actually recover the hidden message. Okay, this is different from the second objective where we just determine whether there is a secret communication going on. Okay, and then number 3 is to actually recover the hidden messages, because usually the case, okay, there is some messages indeed discovered in the suspected carrier, but sometimes the message that is being carried is perhaps is encoded or encrypted, so you cannot actually see what is actually being shared between Alice and Bob. So that is where the third objective is to try to recover the hidden messages. So perhaps when you actually recover or discover what is actually in the suspected carrier, but you cannot actually read it. Okay, so for the third objective, you try to actually break the encryption and try to actually recover the hidden message. Or if, let's say, you cannot determine whether there is indeed secret communication or you cannot recover the hidden message, so for the third objective is to actually to stop the communication. So by stopping here doesn't mean to stop any communication at all from going from Alice to Bob, but try to actually eliminate the element of secret messages between Alice and Bob. So this is where perhaps just by being a passive warden previously or monitoring the channel is not enough. So the Wendy's role here is to be an active attacker where he will actually try to eliminate any form of possibility that there can be any hidden messages embedded within the communication. For example, in earlier chapter, we have discussed on the use of perhaps changing the format of communication, or perhaps from just using PNG format, perhaps the PNG is converted to PDF, or perhaps from 16-bit converted to 8-bit PNG, or perhaps just change the compression is being used from the between Alice and Bob. So there can be any possible method to actually stop the communication, but actually at the same time allowing on the surface communication still going on. So this is where you need to remember the objective of Steganalysis. First of all, try to identify the suspected carrier. Secondly, determine whether it actually carries a hidden message. Third, if possible, try to recover the hidden message that is being communicated. And if, let's say, the determination of the carried information is not possible, try to actually stop the communication from actually goes through. So as for the third objective, it actually depends on the role of the adversary. Remember, there are an active and passive warden. So the question that should be raised by the adversaries here is that, first of all, is it important to actually stop the communication, or is it important to prove the communication existed between sender and receiver, or is it important to actually extract the suspected message? So for the second question, actually, let's say you cannot actually determine who is actually sending the secret messages. You don't know who actually send and receiving on the other end of your communication channel. So you don't have a suspect, but you actually wants to actually stop any secret communication or any information from leaking. Okay, so from the obvious channel, you cannot actually see there is secret communication, but you cannot stop actually to feel that you want to actually stop any secret communication that's leaking important information from your organization to the outside. So here, the role is actually focusing on actually stopping the communication, that is, in this case, stopping the secret communication, while at the same time you are allowing perhaps just text communication to go through. So in this case, while allowing the text communication to go through, you try to limit the option of perhaps the word that they can use, or the type of format that they can use, or anything that perhaps can hinder any embedding attempt in the process of the communication. So in this case, you actually treat everyone in the organization, whether in and out, the same way you actually treat perhaps if you are actually having a suspect. So everyone that is using the communication channel will actually get their message perhaps being compressed down, or perhaps being cut down in certain section, while allowing the essential communication to actually be going on. And then usually the case is that we don't actually want to prove there is secret communication or there is indeed secret communication being communicated, and it is just enough for the communication to be stopped from being done in the first place. So usually the role of the adversary in any steganography scenario is to actually try and stop the communication from going on. We don't actually focus so much on who is the sender and who is the receiver communicating, but we are actually focusing on stopping the secret communication that perhaps leaks secret information to the outside. So as future investigators of a information system or perhaps a forensic analysis, the challenge of Steganalysis is actually to identify specific characteristic of the cover media or the steganography method that is being used by the suspects. And this is a very challenging field because of the abundance of method that can be used to actually manipulate digital media, and we actually have few knowledge to actually identify each and every method signature, because there can be so many ways to actually exploit any digital way of communication. So the next best thing that you can actually do is to attempt to minimize the possibility that the media that you actually allow to being used for communication can be exploited for secret communication using steganography. So the challenge here for you as future investigator is first of all to determine which media is actually can be used as possible cover or carrier of the secret communication. Okay, this could be easy if you have a certain policy on, let's say, any department actually handles secret information or private information that cannot be leaked outside. You can just limit the communication or media that can enter into a certain room. So for example, you limit from one department that handles sensitive information. The only way for information to get out of that room is perhaps by permitting only text communication going on, or perhaps just by allowing only hard copy information that can go in and out of the room. Okay, so you can think of any policy that can actually safeguard the actual communication that you don't want to be possibly leaked to the outside party. So by that, you actually limit the numbers of media that can be exploited to actually carry out the information to the party outside. So this is actually determined on how well do you want to actually safeguard and which channel that you can use to actually limit the communication that can go in and out of the sensitive location. And then the second challenge of Steganalysis is to actually identify which steganography algorithm is actually being used by the suspect or perhaps can be used to actually leak the information. And the second challenge is a very much challenging and true challenge for the investigator, since we have so many methods written every day, because digital media can be used by anyone and everyone have knowledge to actually exploit certain media to actually carry secret information. And then for the third challenge is to actually discover what is the message or how to prove there is actually a message inside the suspected carrier. And then of course, the fourth challenge is related to the third one, because let's say the perpetrators is using encryption to actually hide the secret message. And usually when using encryption, you are using certain key to actually encrypt your secret information. And this is actually relatable if, let's say, you actually want to extract the message that is being discussed between the sender and receiver, and you want to actually see what they are discussing about. So again, return back to the role of the adversary. Are you a passive adversary or are you an active adversary? But usually the most relatable challenge with regard to either he is a passive adversary or an active adversary is to identify the cover and perhaps the algorithm so that you can actually limit the channel that can be used as carrier for the secret communication. So there are four general steps to detect the use of steganography. So for the first step is to actually use visual detection on the actual media structure. So you can actually use your visual perception to detect visual anomaly on the suspected stego object. For example, if let's say for the first one, if you have the original image that can be used as the carrier, and then you have comparison on before and after the encryption has gone through to the cover object. So usually this anomaly can be seen from perhaps color degradation, and let's say he or she is using text-based steganography, you can see there is a certain pattern in the language, usually in terms of the similarity of pattern or conversation that always go through between the sender and the receiver. So for the first one is using visual detection, but by using this, actually you have to actually analyze each and every one of the suspected media that goes through your channel. Secondly, if the suspected carrier is actually an audio or perhaps video, so you can use audible detection, which is you try to detect extra audio signal or visual signal embedded on top of the suspected stego media. So you see perhaps try to detect perhaps any extra noise or perhaps any video degradation when the suspect is actually sending and receiving those types of media within their communication. For the third one, use statistical detection or histogram analysis. So basically, you run through the image or the suspected media through any statistical detection or histogram analysis to see whether there is any anomaly or there is a certain pattern in the file structure after perhaps the carrier is being suspected. So here again, the key here is to actually see whether there is a suspicious communication going on in the first place before you actually put certain type of analysis to go through on the suspected media. The fourth step that you can use to detect the use of steganography is to actually look at the structural detection. So this can be done by comparing file properties, the contents, and also the metadata of the suspected file. But for this to actually be successful, you have to actually have the suspected cover media that is being used, and then perhaps the intercepted stego media that you already intercepted when you have the suspect. So you can analyze the size difference perhaps, or the date and time difference of the cover media and the stego media, or perhaps to see the difference in contents or color or modification between the stego object and the cover object, and perhaps other details that you can actually use for comparison between the cover object and the stego object. So from the previous step, those steps can actually be grouped into two different categories. First, there is an anomaly detection, which is we look for change of pattern on the suspected media that we intercepted, which is where we can use histogram analysis, the change in file properties, use statistical analysis, or detect whether there is a difference in visual or audible cues. Secondly is for signature detection, where you try to actually attempt to look for unique signature of the algorithm being used. This is very important because sometimes it is not always ideal to have or intercepted or have a possession of the cover image that is being used, and usually we actually could intercepted only the Sego object, the object that actually already have the secret message there to be analyzed. So the next option that we have is to actually try to detect a signature of certain steganography method being used to that stego object. So for a Steganalysis example, we can see in this picture here, okay, an example of a histogram analysis. So usually a normal uh, media, they have a very random distribution of uh, pixel value. So the luminance and the color value is usually very random. Okay, so here you see, if let's say an image actually has a certain embedding going on, so you can see the distribution is very much different in terms of it is very uniform, and you can see certain pattern that is actually different from far from being random. So this is where histogram analysis comes in. So you can see actually the distribution of the RGB value here in this example is very much distributed fairly in all of the color luminance value. So this is one method that we can use Steganalysis to actually prove there is actually secret communication going on. But in this step, we cannot actually extract the secret message. We can actually determine whether there is indeed certain embedding going on in the suspected stego object. And in the second example, we can also use file properties comparison. But in this case, in order for the method to work, you actually must have in your possession the untouched cover object, and then you must also have the intercepted stego object to actually compare the file properties. So by having the two files together, you can actually compare the changes in size, or perhaps see the modification date and see the creation date between the two files together. So by having see the comparison of the file properties, usually you can actually have a certain proof that there is indeed the files has gone through some modification and some embedding is perhaps have been done to the original file to actually transform it into the stego object. And usually when you have embedding, you can see there is perhaps some increase in the size of the file, or there is the change in the creation date, or you can see the modification date stored in the metadata of the suspected file. For the third example, so you can actually look for certain signature for a suspected steganography method. Of course, that also is not very ideal because there are so many methods nowadays that can actually exploit the usage of digital media to actually hide certain information. And usually, it is not very ideal to actually have in your possession the original files or untouched file to make comparison easier, because it is very hard to actually have the in your possession a copy of an untouched file, and it rarely happens in steganography or steganalysis. And usually the next best thing is you can also use notepad or hex editor to identify certain anomaly in file patterns. And also by continuously monitoring and analyzing files, certain pattern of repetitive signature can be obtained. So in this case, what you can actually intercept is just the suspected medium being used by the suspect, and then try to actually see the repetition of pattern within the file structure being shared by the suspect and also the receiver. Now, one of the hex editor that you can actually try to download is you actually try to download WinHex. So WinHex is actually a tool that allows conversion between ASCII and hex and allows comparison of files. So you can actually save the comparison as a report and search differences or equal bytes in the suspected file, and it can also actually contain file marker capabilities and allow string searches to actually analyze the ASCII and hex within the suspected file. So for example here, this is an example of the file that is perhaps containing secret information. So in this case, it allows conversion between ASCII and hex. So you can actually search for certain signature of the file. So if these are familiar, if let's say you are actually taking computer forensics class, usually you will be introduced to the hex editor, where you can actually search for certain string that perhaps contain suspected messages, or you can see the differences in the file or the hex value of the file. And you can see here there are certain suspected value inside the file that perhaps can be suspected as carrying secret information. And also you can actually see certain patterns of differences in the value and what does that value mean in terms of perhaps secret messages that can possibly be carried on by that value. So for the next one, we continue to signature-based Steganalysis that can be used to identify signatures of many forms. By stating signatures, we mean that usually the case there is no original file or untouched file that we can compare to the intercepted stego object. So in this case, the next best thing that we can do is to actually search for signature or pattern to determine the presence of hidden messages. And usually, the signature can reveal programs used to hide the message. But of course, the challenge here is still there because there are so many programs or methods that can actually be used to hide secret information. Though it is still challenging, but it is still one of the options that you can use to actually perform steganography and steganalysis. So other method, you can use the hex or you can use the histogram analysis and to see whether there is the repeated pattern between any suspected media that is being shared by your suspects. So how do we actually try to detect certain pattern of communication that is going on between the suspected media that is actually being distributed in your channel? So there are two phases in the Steganalysis attempt. So there is the training phase and also the testing phase. So for the phase 1, we use training media. Let's say we have text, audio, video, and image available. So we embed it with hidden information using train set of steganography algorithm. So let's say you have 100 methods of steganography algorithm. You test and embed certain messages using the steganography algorithm. So after embedding, you try to identify features from the stegomedia that is generated by the tested algorithm. So you see whether there is a reduce or increase in size, color degradation, different in histogram, different in hex value, and then after that you train the classifier program or train your analyst to look for these features in the suspected media. So the training phase is actually to see pattern that can be identified after extracting. So you use the training media, you perform feature extraction, and you train your classifier program. Actually, this can be an interesting topic for final year project. Whether you can actually uh, develop a Steganalysis method by actually embedding different types of media using a set of steganography algorithm. So phase 1 is to actually train your classifier to identify features from every steganography algorithm available to you so that you can actually identify each and every one of those steganography algorithm, what is their pattern in actually changing the media that they actually use to carry secret information. After you train the classifier, phase 2 is to actually employ general testers to use the test media previously and ask them to actually embed those media with the hidden information using the steganography algorithm that you actually have in your possession earlier. So you extract features from the stego media and use the classifier that you have trained earlier to look for these features in the suspected media. So you ask the classifier to check the classification result and improve the classifier again from time to time based on the result. Because you actually want to see whether the classifying features that you have identified in phase 1 can actually be used if, let's say, you want to identify those features again when other people is using the method. Now, after the two phases, the final step is actually the phase 3. The first two phases is just the training and the testing phase. Now phase 3 is actually to use the classifier that you have trained and improved on the field to detect the suspected communication. So in this case, you actually use field data to actually see the performance of your classifier after you have improved it in the first two phases. So based on the result, you always need to continuously improve the classifier by adding more method and adding more classification methodology in your classifier. So this is the only way where you can have a very effective Steganalysis method that you can use if you don't have the original clean cover media that you can use as comparison. So in this case, you have the classifier to identify if, let's say, your suspect is using method 1. So it can identify based on the intercepted message that indeed the suspect is using the method 1 to actually hide information. If, let's say, the suspect is using method 2, your classifier can identify that the suspect indeed is using method 2. So this is very important because currently it's very hard to actually have an ideal situation where we actually have in possession the untouched cover media together with the embedded stego media that actually contains the secret information. So if we don't have any comparison that we can actually compare between the two objects, using a classifier is actually the most uh, possible way to actually try to prove there is actually secret communication going on between the suspect and the receiver. So for this part, we actually need to actually how to have a proper conduct when using steganography. So best practices when using a steganography method to actually evade steganalysis is first of all to use a password, okay, different than your operating system password when required to use a key to hide your message. And then delete original message or cover media that you use Once you have created a new media with the hidden message, try to remove the steganography program after hiding the message and run the steganography program from a CD if possible. Because if you are the users of steganography media, you actually want to remove any signs of perhaps that can be traced back to perhaps what information that you use to hide the information, what key that you use to encrypt information, what cover media that you use to actually hide information, what program that you use to hide the information, and actually is there is any available program that can run steganography actually installed in your machine. So this can be the best practice when using steganography. But you always need to remember steganography is always a two-edged sword of application. It can be used for good, it can be used for evil. And also at the other side, you can also be the investigator trying to find out whether your suspect indeed uses steganography. So by knowing this best practice of using steganography, you can also use this knowledge to actually analyze the suspect machine when perhaps you have the possession of the machine after a certain incident has occurred. So from a Steganalysis point of view, you as the future investigator must try and look for weaknesses of the steganography's user that you have perhaps captured or intercepted. So try and use every available password that have been used by the suspect. Second, look for the last files accessed on the suspect's machine. And then try to find traces of programs installed on the suspect machine. So you can use any method to actually recover files that is deleted from the machine. Okay, if you actually have followed forensic classes before, you know what program that you can use to actually extract files that have been deleted or destroyed from the hard drive. And then look for browsers for files or transmission traces between the suspect and his or her receiver. So this can be used to actually assist your Steganalysis attempt. If let's say the suspect have leaked a significant amount of secret information. So now you have a suspect, you have perhaps the machine of the suspect in your possession for investigation. Now you need to actually prove that the suspect indeed leaked certain information by the use of steganography. So by understanding how steganographer actually work, you can actually use that to your advantage when you're actually performing Steganalysis or investigation of your own in the future. So now let us review what we have learned in this chapter. So the first one is you need to understand there are many different approaches in steganography that can be used to assist you later on in identifying each strength and weaknesses of each steganography method. Of course, you cannot be a one-man show kind of investigator because there are so many media that can be exploited or used by people that try to actually perform or leak certain information. So you must have your own team that perhaps an expert in text-based or linguistic-based steganography, image-based steganography, audio and video-based steganography. So you need to have specialized individual that can be actual expert in their ability to classify each and every one of those methods, what is their signature, what is the pattern, what you must look at when you actually do the analysis, okay? And then also what can assist you is to understand previously the steganography triad. in recognizing a method that you are actually analyzing in terms of its strengths and limitation. So always try to update your knowledge with all the available steganography method on the field that people can actually use. And then of course, build your own classifier to assist you in analyzing any possible steganography attempt that you can actually intercept in the future. So of course, it goes back to what is the objective of your Steganalysis attempt, whether you want to be an active warden or are you the passive warden. So know yourself, know the purpose of your investigation, then it can assist you greatly later on when perhaps if you are involved in steganography related cases. So by that, I end the chapter, but for the next activity, I want you to go back to your steganography method that you have developed in the Lab 1 mini project. So we see what you need to do next. So for the Lab 2 assignment, so we will have a game of prisoners versus warden. So you need to play a game to see how well your method can hide from being discovered. So what you need to do, okay, using your method that you have developed from the Lab 1 mini project, you need to generate 2 stegomedia containing hidden messages. Okay, remember previously the requirement is you just to generate 5 messages. For now, your method, you need to actually just generate 2 stegomedia containing your hidden message. And then you must also describe the scenario clearly. Where can actually this method be used for conversation, perhaps for sending messages? What type of messages that it can actually generate? Okay, so to blindside other people, generate 10 normal messages of the same type, similar to your stego media. And then you need to only inform me of which stego media actually contains the hidden message. And then after that, your stego media will be distributed to the other group to see whether they can actually identify which one is the actual stego media. So prepare your material by next week and submit by Friday to me, okay, by 12 p.m. Because after you submitted the material, I need to actually distribute those methods and swap it around to the other group. Alright, so by that, I end today's chapter and I hope you gain very beneficial knowledge with regard to Steganalysis that you later on can use in future as future investigator. So I will see you again next week. Thank you for joining.